but the title of the meeting today is Why is Capitalism Addicted to Fossil Fuels? Our speaker is Amy Leather, who's the Joint National Secretary of the SWP. And yeah, I won't hold the floor any longer. I'll just give it over to Amy.
Thanks, Ant. Okay, well, there's now general scientific agreement regarding climate change and that global warming is taking place on an unprecedented scale. So in 2012, a report by the World Bank warned that we're currently now on track for a 4-degree warmer world by the end of the century. It's really not certain whether human life could adapt to life at that temperature at all. And it's very clear that if we don't cut our carbon emissions quickly, then we face climate catastrophe. There's one very simple solution: stop burning fossil fuels. We need to stop burning coal, oil, gas, which release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and are responsible for the bulk of carbon emissions. Instead, we need to leave fossil fuels in the ground and make a rapid switch from coal, gas and oil energy generation to using renewables such as solar, wind and tidal. In fact, the opposite is happening though. According to new research, we're actually pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a rate faster than has been seen at any point in the past 66 million years. Rather than cutting emissions, global emissions have grown. If you just look at the period from 1751 to 2010, so what, about 260 years, I think that is, half of all the carbon dioxide emissions from the burning of fossil fuels happened after 1986. So the period when we actually knew that this was a problem and all the agreements and talks were meant to be happening. So why on earth is this happening? When you think about the whole future of the planet being at stake, why aren't we breaking from fossil fuels and switching to renewables as quick as we can? And what I want to try and do in this meeting really is look at why fossil fuel use is locked into capitalism and how, although climate change has accelerated in the post-war period after the Second World War, fossil fuels actually became locked into capitalism from its very birth. And so it's interesting to think, well, you know, why aren't we moving to renewables? Because we do actually hear quite a lot of the new renewable projects that are going on. And in some ways it's true. The output of wind and solar power has grown in recent years. Global wind power capacity increased by 32% in 2009. Photovoltaics, what we know as the use of solar panels, increased by 53% that year. And actually, you just think of some of the places, I think it was in the year and a half leading up to April 2014, more solar power was adopted in the US than the previous 30 years altogether. In fact, that's the year in 2013, 100% of the fresh electricity in Massachusetts and Vermont came from the sun. In that same year, China installed more solar panels than any other country had done in a single year. Problem is that this increase in renewables is absolutely tiny compared to fossil fuel use. So in 2013, if you exclude hydropower, renewable sources generated just 3% of total electricity. So far more energy actually entered the world economy from coal than any other fuel. And so any rise in renewables that you can point to actually was dwarfed by this increase in fossil fuel use. And this isn't because renewables couldn't provide all our power. There's lots of studies that show that this can be done, that a very good study showed that all new energy could come from wind, solar, tidal, geothermal by 2030, and actually by 2050, the entire world economy, manufacturing, transportation, housing, everything could be done by renewable electricity, 90% from the sun and wind, and it could be done by technologies we already have developed. But we haven't even started this transition. And like I say, the proportion of renewables is so tiny compared to the fossil fuel energy use. And so rather than displacing coal, really what you do when you have another wind turbine or a solar panel at the moment is just adding another slice to this ever-growing sort of energy pie, if you like. And we're not going to make a transition to renewables just by building a sort of renewables infrastructure alongside the existing fossil fuel infrastructure. Actually, what you'd need to do is directly suppress fossil fuel use. It's worth noting this because sometimes solutions are put forward that, maybe have a carbon-free town or a village, and some people have done this. It shows what's possible. Problem is it actually has no impact on climate change globally at the moment. The point really here is that a transition is only a transition if you replace fossil fuels with renewables, and that's not what's happening. And it's not only not happening, but fossil fuel use is increasing. We've seen over the last decade a whole boom in what you might call dirty energy. Fracking, deep water drilling, tar sand extraction, all of them allowing us to continue to extract fossil fuels, even if they're in hard-to-reach locations. And sometimes these are given sort of a green gloss. You know, fracking is a bridge fuel, it's a bit cleaner than coal. Well, we can discuss it, but I'm sure everyone will agree fracking is not a clean fuel. And actually it's putting off any transition, isn't it? Because what's going on is more and more investment into extracting fossil fuels rather than looking into different ways. And it's just worth noting at this stage, we do live in a global system as well, and it's very integrated. So, for example, if you look at the US, its coal industry faced competition from the cheap gas that fracking provided. What did it do? It didn't stop coal production, it just exported it all to China. So the US could say, oh yes, our emissions have gone down. Well, that's not much good to the planet when the emissions are still happening across the globe. Similarly in Germany. Germany is often held up as a brilliant example of making a transition to renewables, but it's taken no action to phase out coal. It's allowed its companies to export it, and the sort of coal that Germany produces has actually very high emissions. So again, it shows what's possible. Germany's used lots of renewables, but it shows the limits as well at the moment. So why on earth is this happening? Because if the potential exists to use renewables, why are we still investing in fossil fuels? And I think to understand this, we have to look at the nature of the whole system. Actually, that's the system of capitalism, to understand why this transition is not happening and why we became locked into fossil fuel in the first place. Just to stand back, you see, capitalism is an immensely dynamic system, but it's also driven forward really by the relentless pursuit of profit. And it's driven by two key divisions. The key division is that of class. Those at the top who own everything, all the corporations, the mines, the factories, the institutions, everything like that. And the majority of us who own nothing go and work for one or other of these capitalists. There's another divide, though, as well, between the capitalists themselves. You know, they're united against us, but they're all in competition with each other, aren't they? And they're in competition to make more profit. Of course, not just... They are greedy, but it's not about their own personal greed. It's the logic of the system. It's a matter of survival. They need profit to plough back into production so they can have more efficient methods to undercut their rivals. Because if they can produce cheaply, more efficiently, then they can lower their costs and undercut their rivals and capture more of the market. So if they don't do this and invest in more productive techniques, they'll be driven out of business. That's the logic. Marx called it accumulation for accumulation's sake. But these dynamics are quite central to capitalism and to understanding the problems that we face, really, about the shift from fossil fuels. Just look at it on one level. Think about carbon reserves, reserves of oil, gas and coal. You see, for an oil or gas company to stay in business and attract new investment, they have to prove to their shareholders that they've got lots of fresh carbon reserves to exploit in the future after the ones in production have been used. At a minimum, an energy company needs to have as much oil and gas in its proven reserves as it does in current production. It's called a reserve replacement ratio of 100%. It needs to prove it's got the oil to stay in business, otherwise they'll be quite alarmed, the shareholders. So they have to have a plan. Actually, it's this that's pushed a lot of these companies into these extreme forms of dirty energy, because actually the conventional deposits of oil and coal and gas have been depleted. So that's why they've been pushed into finding these more extreme ways of extracting stuff in the ground. But what this meant, for example, is that in 2009, Shell, they found that this reserve replacement ratio had dipped to 95%. So to reassure the market that it was not in trouble, they stopped all their new investments in wind and solar energy, and at the same time went for a strategy of adding new reserves from shale gas through fracking, deep water oil and also tar sands. And by doing this, they managed to add a record $3.4 billion barrels, that is, of oil, which is equivalent in these new reserves. That was 3 times its production in 2009. So they increased their reserve ratio to 288% and thereby kept their stock price high. So they have to constantly find new sources that they buy up and have ready. And you could think, well, OK, we can see why you want to keep investors happy within capitalism, but why can't they do that by finding new forms of renewable energy? And this is really because of the vast historic sunken investments in the fossil fuel economy in capitalism. Because like I say, you're trying to buy up these reserves of carbon, but they've already bought them. And once they've bought them, they have to use them, really, to get their money back. So in 2011, a study showed that the oil, gas and coal corporations already have, now these are giant numbers, 2,795 gigatons of carbon reserves. But to make that concrete, they already have on their books 5 times more carbon than we could actually burn and stay within any chance of keeping global warming to just 2 degrees. So they've got all this on their books already. And the amounts of money are huge. It's worth $27 trillion to them. So really, if we were serious about stopping global warming, keeping it with the 2 degrees, 80% of what they own would be just useless, a stranded asset, as it's called. So it's not a surprise. These companies are going to resist any change, any legislation, and move to renewables. They bought that carbon, it needs to be sold to get that back. But it's not just the actual carbon reserves that are at stake, it is the whole infrastructure of capitalism, because it's actually built on fossil fuel, first coal and then oil as well. And these mean there's enormous sunken investments there. Think about the investments in the current energy infrastructure of coal mines, oil rigs, refineries, gas fields, the pipelines, all the different structures, not to mention related industries like road, aviation, plastics, petrochemicals, industrialised agriculture. A fossil fuel landscape, if you like, it's very precious to those that have invested in it. And many of these structures are very expensive, been made on a colossal scale, and very durable. They last a very long time. You just think about the decades that will be made to recover the outlay made on a tar sands mine or a trans-Canadian pipeline or anything like that. They need to use those investments until all the cost is retrieved. And so capitalists have a vested interest in the endurance of that fossil fuel landscape, which is obviously in direct opposition to the idea of terminating the use of fossil fuels. And what's more, it's not really just about covering the initial investment that's made. Once, say, you've invested in a power plant and you've paid all that money back, it doesn't even then make sense to just knock it down, because actually you've still got it in use, haven't you? It's like cost-free once it's been paid back. And so, really, if you started decommissioning that structure and constructing another, it would be to start all over again with your costs. So it's interesting that 2/3 of US power plants that were built since the 1890s are still in use. But for this reason, the investments are so great. So we may want to dismantle the fossil fuel economy as quickly as possible. To preserve the future of the planet, that's what needs to happen. But this would mean a vast global write-off of capital on an unprecedented scale, really. It's rational for the sake of the planet. It's irrational for the point of view of the individual capitalist. And that problem continues. It gets worse as time goes on, because as we postpone the emission cuts, the fossil fuel infrastructure gets greater. It amasses more weight, because investment doesn't stop, does it, as we have the talks and think about the targets we're going to meet. It continues in the fossil fuel economy. And so more and more capital is invested, more and more would have to be destroyed or liquidated if ever we were to make that shift. And actually, if you just look at the first decades of the new millennium, more coal-fired power plants were constructed than in any previous decade. So how have we ended up in this way? Why has capitalism become wedded to the fossil fuels? And some people, look at the periods post-1945. There is a very big acceleration of energy use and therefore emissions in that time. Some people then look very much at the periods from the 1980s onwards, really, sort of some of the periods where policies called neoliberalism come to dominate. And these periods, I'll look at briefly, have factors that drive things, absolutely, and accelerate carbon emissions, but they can't really explain why we became dependent on fossil fuels in the first place. And the fact is, the whole development of capitalism is entwined with this growth of this fossil fuel economy. And to understand that, we actually have to go back 200 years to look at what happened at the start of the Industrial Revolution, because that's actually when emissions start to grow on a different scale. And it's actually at this point, in the early decades of the 1800s, that an energy transition takes place. Because the machines that first came to dominate in the cotton industry in the mills of Manchester began to be powered by steam, which was fuelled by coal. Now, Watt had invented the steam engine in 1784, and this could be used to drive other machines in that way. But it was not an automatic process that just because he invented the steam engine, this was just then adopted. What's very interesting is if you look at the cotton industry in Britain, which, as I say, is really where many of the features of industrial capitalism begin and where we see the factory system begin. Actually, at the beginning, the machines and factories were powered by water, using giant water wheels. In fact, very early on in the Industrial Revolution, all the early spinning machines and the new innovations in that field, which provided the basis for the Industrial Revolution, were unfossilised. They weren't developed originally with steam and from burning and to burn coal that would power them. And it's interesting, if you look at the year 1800, there were at least 1,000 water mills concentrated in Lancashire and Scotland, only 84 steam engines being used. That's about 16 years after the invention of the steam engine. Water still very much in the ascendancy, driving the spinning machines and the cotton mills at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution. Huge profits being made. Drawing in more capitalists, actually, to invest. They see the profits being made, we'll have some of that as well, plough back into the mills, reinvest in new and improved machines and more powerful water mills. And this is really, like I said, the factory system, which commodities are churned out in massive quantities, arose on the basis of water. So why is there then a shift to coal? Well, actually, the transition from water to steam, and I really would at this stage, I would recommend reading this book, actually, called Fossil Capital by Andreas Malm. It's a fantastic read. A lot more space to elaborate on the points I'll try and make here. But really, the transition to steam was not linear or automatic. It was actually quite a contest over a number of decades, really battling between sort of steam and water power. Even as late as the 1820s, most of the mills in Manchester were still water-powered. But actually, in the next 10 years, this changes. And it becomes the opposite way. From the mid-1830s, most of them powered by steam, and steam is then predominant, and that continues. Now, you see, at the start, the main advantage of water power for the capitalist was that water was free, unlike coal, which you have to buy. And so what Malm, in this book, argues is that the shift to steam did not occur because it was cheaper or because it was more reliable at that point. It wasn't particularly. But ultimately, it allowed capitalists to exploit labour better. It gave them better access to and control over labour, over workers. You see, the problem was, for water power, you had to put your mill where the water was. You know, the waterfall, the rapids, probably in some rural area. It began to be a problem. These areas didn't have a lot of workers. And those that were there were still used to agricultural work. They didn't really want to work for long hours under factory discipline inside all day. And they tried to, they actually used orphans as apprentices for a while to get the staff in, as it were, or they built what they called colonies, settlements around the mill. This wasn't ideal. Orphans weren't great workers, and it's a very big investment for the capitalists to also not only build their mill, but all the houses, the schools and the infrastructure around it. And a bit of a problem if there's a industrial strife, if you like, in militancy, because the workers not only smashed up the mill, they smashed up the whole infrastructure, and the capitalists had to repay it. In contrast, steam-powered mills could be used in the cities, which were actually already growing. There were close to very large numbers of workers who were used to, were much more disciplined, used to factory work of some kind. And if there was strikes or militancy, then there was this army of unemployed workers who could take their place, a very good disciplining factor. So the big advantage of coal was its mobility, if you like. That source of power could be taken to where the workers were, rather than having to take all the workers to the power. And this gave the capitalists a lot more control. And then they didn't have to undertake such big investments, like I say, setting up these colonies next to the water source. Actually, the final nail in the coffin for water were the Factory Acts, 1833, and then there was the 10 Hours Bill of 1844, which actually stopped children being working in these, and also limited the number of hours in a day that could be worked. And this was very important because one of the main ways in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, one of the main ways they competed was getting people to work longer hours so that more could be produced, so you could undercut your rivals. Very important actually for water, because it was true that sometimes it didn't rain or it wasn't quite as much water as you needed, but they could make up their lost time by working longer hours the next day or the day after. Once that avenue is then closed off, the advantage falls to steam. Not subject to those pressures in the same way, can increase the intensity of work as steam power improves. So what happens is a number of factors come together that lead to this shift to steam among cotton manufacturers, essentially enabling the capitalists better to exploit workers and compete. Now, there's a number of conclusions that follow from this. One is the fossil fuel economy we know today began in Britain. 80% of global emissions of carbon dioxide were from Britain in 1825. Coal consumption tripled in the 1800s. But rather than it being all of the British population in it together for steam, what really is argued by Malm in this book is that you can see steam almost arising as this form of power exercised by some people against others. This newly arising capitalist class against industrial workers, actually often resisted by workers, who were fighting for their jobs. And also, if you look at some of the Chartist protests, the plug plot riots, where they went and pulled the plugs out of the steam engines, let out the water and things like that. But crucially, the point is here, is that once steam is introduced, it unleashes a process, a path of development, which fossil fuels are at the heart of it. As I said, it's not inevitable. It's possible to imagine capitalism without fossil fuels, if they didn't exist, for example, or if they hadn't been discovered. But once they are introduced, then all capitalists have to turn to steam to stay in business through that pressure of competition. And so mill owners adopt coal and steam as the energy basis of production. Other capitalists are doing the same for transport, steam engines to actually move the raw cotton to the mills in Manchester. There's a boom in railway building in the 1850s. And it unleashes as well a process that isn't just confined to Britain, but actually the shift to coal then has far-reaching global consequences. It's actually spread across the globe through both economic competition, but also military invasion. You know, it was the coal-powered ships and railroads from Britain that really allowed it to seize control over territories in Asia, Africa, the Middle East that had long resisted conquest. So it drives out the use of fossil fuels beyond Britain itself. And although Britain was a generation ahead in adopting them, very soon other countries are catching up really by the end of the 1800s. So we see how fossil capitalism or the fossil fuel economy is born in the 1800s and then really grows, and you can see a history of capitalism marked by the ever-increasing use of coal, gas and oil. And you see this very much then becoming absolutely entrenched in the first 4 decades before the Second World War. And it's accelerated by other features of capitalism, really, which you really see playing out in the first 4 decades of the 1900s. War, the role of the state, and the growth in the size of firms. And, you know, war is a feature of capitalism, how economic competition spills into military competition. This is how both boosted by fossil fuel use and drives it further. The state helps that process through its investments, and the size of corporations accentuates it further. It's also entrenched further by the arrival of oil, because I've just talked about coal so far. Now, inventions of the internal combustion engine in the 1880s and of the airplane in 1903, they start creating a market for petroleum. That had just been used as lighting before or for lubrication. These new machines use something called gasoline, which was a part of petroleum that the refiners just discarded before it was useless and dangerous. And really, who are the major customers for gasoline, or we would call it petrol? It's the imperial armies. An absolute crucial factor for oil was the decision in 1912 here in Britain to switch battleships from coal to oil. Interestingly, class struggle plays a role in this as well, because the coal used for the battleships had been produced in South Wales, particular type of coal. Actually, there have been big strikes there. First thing Churchill does when he takes responsibility for the army in 1911 is he says, right, I'm going to convert the battleships to oil because want to free ourselves from the political claims of the miners. So you can see how there's a class element to it as well. But what it does mean is that all oil-powered tanks, airplanes, destroyers, submarines, they play a massive role in the First World War. I think there's something like 100,000 trucks and cars used. And you can see at the same time, this is the time when cars start to be mass-produced. And it's worth noting, I mean, this is just in 1929. The car industry was the largest industry in the US. There was nearly 250,000 filling stations, and 2/3 of the oil at that point comes from US wells. You know, the US oil corporations were the biggest and most profitable even then. And of course, you know, it's the chemical industry is also growing, developing new products made from either the byproducts of oil refining or requiring the high levels of energy that only oil could provide. And the growth of the companies that I talk about accentuate this further. I mean, just in 1930, over half of the 200 largest industrial companies in the United States were in chemicals, petroleum, metals, rubber or transportation, obviously all quite closely linked to the sort of petroleum oil complex in that way. And it means that that concentrated power means that production and marketing and other decisions can really have a very big impact across the globe as well. Which brings us to the Second World War, because it's actually, the use of fossil fuels really takes off after the Second World War. Some say this is when they call it the Great Acceleration. Very steep increase in emissions. I just want to say, though, it didn't just start after the Second World War. The conditions for that great acceleration of fossil fuel use were shaped by World War II itself and what happened during it. Because obviously the war itself was immensely destructive. It left Europe, Asia, Africa in ruins. But actually, the US did quite well out of it. It was physically unscathed, and at the end of the war, almost 2/3 of the world's industrial production was concentrated in the US. The US ruling class was very, very rich, and they'd become that way because essentially there were massive state injections of money into private business and corporations to ensure the war effort in the US. Just think about oil. I said it was important in World War I. It was decisive in World War II. Actually, the German army was still, if you look at some of the accounts, still relying on horses and infantry compared to the tanks, airplanes, submarines, aircraft carriers, armoured troop carriers, all needing oil. It created massive demand. I mean, it's interesting, 6 out of every 7 barrels of oil used by the Allied forces came from the US wells and were refined by US oil companies. To ensure that it was supplied, the US government invested in pipelines. They did a deal with Saudi Arabia to ensure that they get access to the oil there. Ensured that there was big investment. Look at during that war, they suspended completely in the US all commercial car production. All of it went into the war effort. But they were given $29 billion to produce all the jeeps and trucks and airplane engines that were needed. And so those industries, after the war, went back to car production, but they had massively updated facilities, expanded, that they could then compete even more. If you look at industrial chemistry as well, again, during World War II, the US government spent over $3 billion to build and expand petrochemical plants to produce the nitrogen for explosives, synthetic rubber for tyres, nylon for parachutes, and much more. After the war, oil and chemical companies were able to buy all those newly updated factories at bargain basement prices. And they were bought by companies we still know today, Monsanto, DuPont. They bought them at prices literally half of what they were worth. And so really, that giveaway by the American state to private business laid the basis of the age of plastic, because plastics hadn't really existed before the war. It became the 3rd largest manufacturing industry in the US, still is today. So you see this big injection of state money to these corporations. It means they end the Second World War with a huge reservoir of cash, productive infrastructure, and it's newer and larger than anything that their competitors have. And it has real implications for the global role of the US and the use of fossil fuels, further locked in to the infrastructure of capitalism. And to compete, others had to do the same. It didn't end there. People have heard about the Marshall Plan. The US government continues to intervene after the war. Now, this Marshall Plan of 1948 gave vast amounts of money to the European governments. It was not out of the good of the hearts of the American state. The purpose was to strengthen the global role of US corporations, especially the oil ones. In fact, representatives of the Rockefeller family, who were the main owners of Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, later renamed Exxon, were among the strongest forces that lobbied Congress to approve the Marshall Plan. And they benefited, because basically the Marshall Plan money had to be used for purchases from the US corporations. So they gave their money to European countries who then had to buy the oil from US oil companies. And they had to buy it at above market prices, and they couldn't buy sort of the less expensive crude oil, because that would mean they'd have to rebuild their own refineries, and they didn't want Europe to rebuild its refineries that would threaten US interests. And at the same time, they also said that although they had to buy this oil from US companies, it couldn't be actually oil from the US, because that needs to be used for domestic US consumption. So they had to get it from the Middle East. So it meant US oil corporations invested more in the Middle East to then supply Europe, and it completely changed the way Europe used oil. Before the war, only 20% of European oil imports came from the Middle East. By 1950, 85% of imports did. So it really accelerates as well Europe's transition from being dependent on coal to dependence on oil. And we see total energy consumption then tripling in this post-war period. World oil production grew by more than 700% in the period from 1946 to 73. So we really can see, like I say, the acceleration of how fossil economy is solidified and globalised in this period. The whole World War II then shapes that terrain that we're in. And of course, there are a number of other trends that drive it forward more. The continued expansion of car use, the industrialisation of agriculture with the use of synthetic fertilisers and pesticides. Actually, very interestingly, continued high military expenditure, even when not at war. Military budget is massive. I mean, analysts calculate that global military spending in 2013 was $1.7 trillion. Actually, the US military is the world's largest user of petroleum, and it's the largest polluter. Interestingly, it was estimated during the 1990s, the US military consumed more than the total commercial energy consumption of nearly 2/3 of the world's countries. And that excludes their fuel that they used in the 1991 Gulf War or the 1998 bombings of Serbia and Kosovo. But military emissions are excluded from the Kyoto Accord. So you kind of think, we're up quite against some big people if we're going to stop global warming. So where does this leave us today? So I think it's a situation, isn't it, where we see these vast, historic, sunken investments in the fossil fuel industries, where those companies dedicated to fossil fuels are kind of propelled to continue in that same direction by the logic of capitalism driving it. And because they are so large and powerful, they have very big lobbying power to continue it as well. I mean, Naomi Klein in the book here, which I won't move because it's properly on my mic, This Changes Everything, she reckoned that in 2013, in the US alone, the oil and gas industry spent $400,000 a day lobbying Congress and government officials. So it's not a surprise, is it though? Not a surprise that they lobby, because globally there is more capital invested in oil and gas than any other industry. And obviously there's lots of different calculations, but one of the ones that I found was that if state-owned oil companies are included, oil and gas capitalisation totals over, it's such a big number, it's hard to make sense of, $6,700 trillion. That's more than all the world's banks combined. Record profits being made. And like I said, the fossil fuel infrastructure involves thousands of coal mines, about 50,000 oil fields, according to the 2011 UN report, and they calculated a world network of 300,000 kilometres of oil pipelines, another 500,000 kilometres of gas pipelines, and 300,000 kilometres of transmission lines. I mean, this is massive infrastructure, isn't it? And the replacement cost of those existing fossil fuel and nuclear power infrastructure is something like $15 to $20 trillion. You know, clearly, they're not going to just decide to write that off, are they, overnight and just replace it? And they keep adding more and more to that fossil fuel infrastructure. So to conclude, really, what I've tried to show is that fossil fuels are entwined with the growth and development of capitalism. Once capitalism adopts fossil fuels, there's no looking back, and they become inseparable and remain so today. Fossil fuels are not an overlay, if you like, that you can just peel away now from capitalism, leaving the rest of the system intact. They're so embedded in every aspect. What is also clear, which I hope I've drawn out, is that decisions, because sometimes people say, well, it's all of us, we all use, we're all responsible for this. Actually, the decisions to move to fossil fuel and its continuation and expansion are not made by all of us, are they? The decisions were actually made by those early capitalists at the start of industrialisation in Britain as a better way to exploit workers. Class interests were bound up for it from the start. Now, of course, those early capitalists could not have known they were setting the world on course for catastrophic climate change. Although it is worth noting that if you read the accounts of the times, Engels, but also many of the workers' accounts in some of the Chartist magazines of the time, they complain about the atmosphere and what it's like not only in the factories but in the streets, how different it is. But the point is they didn't know what they were doing, but we do know now. And of course, though, this is not about rational argument, because the irrationality of capitalism dictates the opposite, because actually from their point of view it's rational to continue in this way. Like I say, it's not a technical problem. We could make a transition to renewables. It's physically possible, but it would cost. It would cost money. And we've seen, though, how the states have invested at certain times in big projects, like I say, during the war, and geared production in that way. The problem is that what they did was actually shored up further that fossil fuel industry by making investments in them, and they become absolutely allied with them in that way. So to break with the fossil fuel economy, it would mean a very big transformation of those structures, a whole reshaping. I mean, essentially, we're talking about we have to get rid of capitalism. But I want to be clear, we are not arguing, therefore there's nothing we can do. And all we've got to do is just wait until there's a revolution, we'll get rid of capitalism, we'll all be fine. That is not what we're saying. Because clearly, those battles constantly within capitalism. There's always a battle, isn't there? Over many things. How much you're getting paid, your conditions at work, but also over environmental questions. Just think about the question of fracking in Britain at the moment. The oil and gas companies thought they would be in full production by now, fracking in Britain. I went to a meeting, actually, last week. Some people in the audience are here who were there. And they said there's only been one frack so far in Britain. Only one. And that's because of the campaigning that's taken place. That's very important because actually it stopped the further expansion of the fossil fuel landscape that I've been describing. It stopped its further entrenchment. And we're going to have to continue that fight, each well, but also through a centralised fight. It's the Tory government that wanted to press ahead with fracking. This is probably quite a good time to have a go at them. They've already actually delayed making a decision about having the third runway. They are so weak, and we could actually, drive them back over this issue. But the questions also get raised in other ways too. Just think, last night, those of you at the rally heard about the French railway worker on strike. The French strikes in the last few months, actually, hit the oil refineries, where there was big strikes. There were blockades of fuel depots. It led to a petrol shortage. Electricity production actually dropped. It had to be imported. Now, the strikes themselves were about a new work law, but it shows where power lies, doesn't it, to start taking on those vast, giant multinational companies that I've talked about. And so I would argue that within the environmental movement, which we need to be part of, we have to then raise these wider questions of capitalism as a whole and how it works, but also where power lies to bring about change. But in every other struggle as well, we also have to raise the question of climate. They go hand in hand, because if we're saying fossil fuels are locked into capitalism, then we have to take on both those issues, but we also have to talk about where power lies to bring about the change and challenge those companies that are both actually driving capitalism forward and have fossil fuels embedded in them as well.
Thanks a lot for that, Amy. What I just realised as well was that I forgot to introduce myself at the start. My name's Anthony. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers Party in Ealing. And just on those books that Amy mentioned, one of them, Fossil Capital, and another one that we have as well, Marxism and Ecology, which is a new pamphlet just being released by Martin, who is running a bookstall just over here as well. They're all available at Bookmarks. You can check them out at the bookstall here or the shop inside the Institute bar. Now, just if you missed it at the start as well, this will be the part where we go into the discussion, the contributions, any questions that you might have. If you just indicate to me if you have anything to say, and then I'll point you out, and then if you come to the front and just use this mic at the side, just so we can pick it up on a recording device. And if you can limit your contributions to 3 minutes, I'll tap on the mic after 2, and then at 3 I'll try and shut you up. But yeah, I saw you first. Yeah. Yeah, please.
It's all been recorded.
Hi, I'm Helen Foe from Dudley SWP. What I've got is a question, really, and it might seem a really stupid question. But what I wanted to know is, how do we marry up the fact that we would like to get rid of fossil fuels with our historic support of the miners and our support of the workers in those industries?
My question's a little bit similar because I heard 2 things yesterday that I found quite depressing. The first one was that the government, whoever that is now, has said that they're going to reduce emissions by 2030 as a percentage of those in 1990, which seems to me to be quite meaningless and just another way of saying that they're kicking it into the long grass. Now, the focus on the shift and the profitability of capitalism to China is entirely dependent upon the building of a massive new fleet of container ships. And I also heard yesterday that these container ships burn something called bunker fuel. And the pollution that this bunker fuel produces in a year is equivalent, and I found this quite a gobsmacking figure, the equivalent that these ships burn is it's equivalent to 50 million cars in a year. And the reason that the pollution is equivalent to 50 million cars is because what they're burning is basically asphalt. It's what's on the roads, because it's the rubbish that left when everything else has been taken out of fossil fuels. This stuff is so thick that you can actually walk on it when it's cold. And there's no restrictions on the pollution that they can create in the middle of the ocean. They don't burn gallons an hour, but they actually burn tons of this stuff an hour. And they're burning this stuff, bringing shit from China. Most of this shit's made from plastic, which also comes from fossil fuels. Now, my question is, when in Socialist Worker, when we report on the capitalist side of the argument, we talk about, they say there's so much growth, and we say they're actually lying, there isn't so much growth, that growth are massaging the figures. I sometimes think we're entering the argument on their side because we're talking about growth. Just one example, every so often we're encouraged to celebrate the fact that more cars have been made. Last year was a record year. I think it was 2.4 or 4.7 million cars were made. Now, why should we celebrate that? That is something that's an absolute disaster for the planet. And of course, as Amy said, it's not just about fuel. It's about it's about fertiliser. It's about all the stuff we buy is made of plastic. A lot of the drugs come from it as well. Now, when I say we're on their territory, it's all about growth, as Amy said. And to me, it seems like we can't keep talking about growth because infinite growth on a finite climate is just not possible. When I've said this before, I've been accused of saying to people that we can't have the stuff we want. We can't have the stuff we want because we can't keep producing it. Now, I'm not saying that because I think it is possible for people to have the stuff I need. So what I want to know is what actually am I saying to people?
It's talking about the addiction to fossil fuels. There's been like talk in about that last 2-3 years about so-called peak oil. And then it's a push for the fracking. There is nothing that says about the addiction to fossil fuels by capital than trying to dig it out with water and contaminating everything than fracking.
The glasses, yeah.
I would slightly disagree with the point about Catherine being completely wedded to fossil, because we can see in Ontario and France almost eliminate use of fossil fuels in electricity production. France is only 60% renewables, hydro and electricity, but France and Ontario are mainly nuclear. And we've seen a rather disgraceful strain to actually shut down nuclear power stations and replace them with fossil fuels in recent years. In Japan, they built a new coal-fired power station, and coal-fired power stations are more dangerous than a malfunctioning nuclear power station. So a nuclear power station, Fukushima could be harmless for all we know. The degree of uncertainty on how dangerous radiation is could allow Fukushima to be essentially harmless, but the evacuation was deadly. But as I say, and the US Navy is in fact, well, their major aircraft guys are all nuclear powered because the problems of transporting fossil fuels are so expensive. And I do understand that they are thinking about using synthetic fuels for their fighter aircraft as well.
Hi, Duncan Smith. A couple of points that I want to raise. Firstly, you talked about the initial craving for coal and oil was based on a technological change. What I want to put to you is that the reason why it's very difficult for capitalism in its abhorrent form to change at the moment is because it hasn't yet had that technological advancement. As a technologist myself, I see that a lot of technologies that are now being enhanced and used in the new green areas are refinements of technologies like the xenodiode and the wind turbines, which is basically a windmill with electric motoring. Those technologies, and they aren't actually new technologies. What I would think that would bring it on is if you had some new, absolute brand new technologies that could then power aircraft at the same speed, so people could travel around the world, that could then power motor cars and other lorries at the same speeds and the same capacities. At the moment, we don't have that. What I suggest is, what I'm hoping is that we also demonstrate as socialists, and we also want to push these new technologies. There are ideas around, but they're not getting the airplay. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
First of all, I'm going to, Anthony Page from Chesterfield SWP. First of all, I'd like to come back on the question of regarding our passed support for the miners. Well, yes, we did support the miners, but it was from a point of view of protecting good, well-paid jobs, and to this day we want good, well-paid jobs, and we can have that in a zero-carbon economy. Now, a pamphlet which I can well recommend is A Million Climate Jobs, which explains how all of the jobs in, say, former coal mining areas could be replaced by an investment in renewables, notably wind power, to some extent solar, by things like insulating houses and what have you, a move towards public transport instead of the private car. Now, one thing which it won't entail, I'm afraid, is a move towards nuclear, because not only is nuclear hideously dangerous and hideously polluting, it's also not carbon neutral. I mean, just to think of all of the carbon which is used in shipping the uranium, let alone then enriching it and what have you for use in nuclear power plants.
I want to return to one of the central points that Amy makes in her speech, which is why are fossil fuels adopted in the very first place? Because actually I think understanding that goes to the heart of understanding some of the other questions about the role of the working class today. You see, the bosses do things to maximise their profits, but they also always think about what does that mean for how their workplaces are organised, how they can exploit workers, and so on. It wasn't the taking up of coal instead of water that improves their profits. It's their ability to exploit and extract surplus value from the workers. And that's what coal allowed them to do it in a number of different ways. And I too would echo the comrade's suggestion to read Fossil Capital by Andreas Malm, because he shows how a number of ways these things start to come together from the mid to the end of the 19th century. Amy talked about things like the need to switch to the urban working class, to have a disciplined workforce who could be used to work in the factories, and if they went on strike there's another load of workers out there. But there's other things as well. The widespread use of water power required competition between capital. It required them to share and organise the use of the water, because they found that rivers would run low, or they'd need massive investment plans to go to new areas and build aqueducts and the rest of it. Once you actually have a steam engine, you don't have to give a fig what the bloke in the factory next to you is doing, because you can run it on your own. So the adoption of fossil fuels is inherently tied up with the very nature of capitalism, those competing blocks of capital who base their profits on the exploitation of the people at the bottom, the workers in the factories. And that means that the fossil fuel economy cannot be separated from that exploitative relationship between bosses and workers. And if we want a sustainable world, we have to get rid of that exploitation at the same time as doing it. And this means actually that the question isn't about new technology and some future technology that will be adopted, because actually one of the problems is renewable energies exist in a way that you could use them. The technology is already there to reduce the emissions. It's not as profitable though for them to do it. So the widespread switch to renewable energy is counter-profitable for the bosses because of the amount of energy you can get out of fossil fuels. The final thing is what is the question about defending workers? See, I defend workers whenever they're on strike to fight, and it isn't just about protecting good jobs. Actually, it's about, if workers win, you improve the combativity and the confidence of the working class to change the world. If the miners had won in 1984, actually we'd be in a much, much better place in terms of the working class movement today to think about moving the economy to a zero carbon area. If we defend workers that are fighting in fossil fuel industries, we're more likely to be able to get them to fight for a transition to a zero carbon energy in the future. If you turn around and say to those workers you're part of the problem, actually you're cutting yourself off and you're making it impossible, because quite rightly they turn around and say sod off. So the job for socialists is to both defend jobs but put, as the comrade said, a vision of a different way of organising society at the heart of our struggle at all times.
Camilla.
I just want to emphasise again really the importance of putting this in terms of being about fossil fuels, because often
you know, when you see the coverage of big conferences like the conference they had in Paris at the end of last year, it's people talking about, you know, do we need 1 degree temperature rise, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, what percentage are we going to reduce our carbon emissions by? I mean, of course, those debates are important, and people, you know, should understand a bit about the science of climate change, but I think they can sometimes make it seem like a very abstract issue, like it's just, you know, a lot of politicians talking about something that's going to happen in the future, and it kind of divorces it from what's happening in people's everyday lives. I think when you look at it in terms of how much fossil fuel is there in the ground and how much can we actually get out and afford to burn, which is very little of it, you know, it actually makes it clear that it's not an issue of, you know, it can seem very apolitical, but it's not apolitical. It's not that we're all in it together. This is an issue of you know, these people that are, you know, want to drill for more and more oil and gas. You know, even when the ice is melting in the Arctic, they see that as an opportunity to drill for more gas and oil. You know, it's them versus all of us. This is a class issue. And I just want to kind of return to the issue of support for the miners, actually. I think it's a very important question. I'm glad you raised it because it's going to keep coming up, I think, especially when you have trade unionists supporting things like Trident, which is another thing that I disagree with. So thanks for raising it. I think Martin put the case very well, but I think there's another thing to add to that, which is, you know, a few years ago there was a strike of airline workers, people working as air stewards, organised by the BASA union, against Willie Walsh, the boss of BA. And, you know, actually you went to their picket lines and, you know, we did support them, but you saw people how angry they were at Willie Walsh, their boss, that was cutting their hours and wages and things. And, you know, actually when you go to that as an environmentalist, actually they all hate Willie Walsh. We all hate Willie Walsh as well because he's the boss of an airline. When you start from that issue of actually we've got a lot in common because, you know, we hate the same bosses that people that work in those industries hate as well, then that kind of puts you in a good position to start talking about fighting for different types of jobs and different type of society.
I want to start off by saying I don't think it's possible to have green power without nationalising the national grid again. You know, like if you're going to have profit pushing power, then it's always going to be the cheapest and the dirtiest of power you could possibly get. You know, there's no incentive for green power at the minute, really. I also got a question about, like, I read an article about 2 years ago on a production of a windmill, and it followed all of the carbon that went into building it from the workers themselves, like going in, the petrol they consumed, and like the actual construction of the windmill, from like the concrete used, from the aluminium. And it turned out like windmills weren't necessarily carbon neutral, which I was quite amazed about. I don't know if that's changed at all recently. I had a question if anyone knows anything about that. Yeah, that's it.
Yourself in the purple? Yeah. Yeah.
Hello. Right, I'm Jade from Scarborough, and I just, you know, I feel, certainly I still have conversations with people about climate change, and people just don't seem to be convinced. Do you know, they still seem to think it's some sort of myth. But to me, you know, we're out of time. You know, even if we just stopped everything we were producing, like right now, today, do you know, the effects, it's, you know, the degrees are already rising and such. And people, you know, it's just sort of how do you get that point of urgency across to people, you know? Because, I mean, as I say, I've got friends sort of in the Labour Party in Scarborough, and just with everything that's gone on with the EU recently, it's, you know, the motion to discuss fracking and such in Scarborough, it's been delayed until September, and I just find that disgusting, you know, when everything is so, you know, it's happening now, you know, there's people that are already having to move out of their homes and such in other countries due to the effects of climate change, and it's just sort of, how do you get that point across to people that, you know, we really, you know, we need to focus on climate change and as much as all the other problems that are going on right now, you know, so there you go.
Richard Buckwell from Nottinghamshire. I want to talk about the trade union angle a bit, because I'm in the Unite Community branch in Notts. We've got quite a lot in the East Midlands. They're probably more developed in that area than other areas in the country. We had a weekend away about what we should be getting involved with, and certainly in the Derby branch they're very involved in environmental activities for the union branch, and I think it's quite a new venture. And in Nottinghamshire we've got about 2,000 people signed up to the anti-fracking movement. It's a really big thing. It's a big ex-mining area. You know, the ex-miners can really see the dangers of fracking, because it's even filthier than what the coal industry was, or will be if it goes ahead. And you know, it's a plea out there to, you know, bring the anti-fracking movement into the unions as well. And I think that, you know, there's an open door there. We're called Unite Community branches, and that's what it means, you know, taking up those community issues as well. You know, we can be very active around things like Sports Direct, but there's no reason why we can't be active around the anti-fracking movement. And I think it's very important to start tying those kind of links.
I haven't seen anyone else indicate yet. Is there anyone who has like a final question or want to come back on anything else that anyone said during that discussion before I bring Amy back to sum up? Yeah, sure. Yeah, that'll be fine. Anyone else? If not, then I'll ask Amy to come back in just for the next 10 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, sorry. Okay.
Cool. But just to plug those books again, there's Marxism and Ecology, which is the new pamphlet which Martin Empson, who's over on the bookstall there, wrote, alongside Fossil Capital, which is the big book that Amy recommended during her talk. If anyone wants to get them, they're at the stall or in Bookmark's bookshop in the IOE bar as well. And if anyone does have any questions that they didn't want to ask during a meeting, just hang around afterwards, and obviously you can talk to any of us in the team shirts, or Amy and Martin will no doubt stay around afterwards as well. But I'll hand it over to Amy.
Okay, well look, if I don't answer all the questions, which I'm bound not to, people should discuss this more. And even if people have sat here and not necessarily agreed with everything, we want there to be discussion. We don't always want to agree in Marxism, so hopefully this will continue during you know, some more of the meetings over the weekend. I'm very glad Comrade talked about China, actually, because I didn't mention it because I didn't have time, but it is something now that a lot of people do talk about, and they blame China for the emissions. And in some ways, you can see why. Actually, there has been a very big increase in emissions from China, but it's all too easy to blame China. And what's quite interesting is this globalised production process that we are seeing, where what a lot of countries have done is essentially outsourced a lot of their manufacturing to countries like China. And so the emissions may be done there, but actually then the finished goods is exported back to the US or the UK. And I think because often people don't look at it in that way, you can blame one country rather than another, and then also end up blaming the wrong people as well. Isn't it all the people in the West fault because they just want cheap goods from China? Well, actually, a lot of the time, people in those countries try to stop the outsourcing of those jobs because actually it hit them. But also those decisions weren't made by ordinary people. They were made in boardrooms by a tiny group of people who made it basically so they can make more profits. Where is it a lower wage place? Now, of course, they don't just move for lower wages, they need an infrastructure, but this is a big part of it as well. And so I do think we have to knock on the head this idea that somehow China is the problem and not our own ruling classes and our own production in that way. And I'm also very glad you brought up container ships, because that was another thing I chopped out of my talk, because it's true. I mean, they're massive emitters of fuel, the bunker fuel that you talked about. Actually, it's if they were counted as a country, I think they'd be the 6th largest emitter in the world. But these emissions aren't counted in anybody's totals. They're not counted in any country's totals. So, you know, you have these agreements to limit emissions, and these go, they're not part of it at all. And so part of this is looking at how things are locked into a wider system of production and who is benefiting from that as well. Now, I think it's actually wrong to, I'm not sure you were trying to do this, but counter coal and nuclear. I'm against both. You know, nuclear power is not a solution to coal. Coal isn't a solution to nuclear. I mean, nuclear, like you said, and someone came back on it, it's not carbon neutral. The dangerous waste, all the accidents, I probably don't need to convince people. People can look at the pamphlet. But this is not an alternative. And basically, we're saying we want to break entirely from the fossil fuel infrastructure in that way. You see, a lot of this is allow people to maintain the big corporations, the same infrastructures that they've built up, and they don't want to break from that. And that's what we're saying needs to happen. Now, the thing is, maybe again I've misinterpreted, but I wasn't trying to say that because there was technological change, that's why steam was introduced with coal, because actually the invention was made, it wasn't immediately taken up. That would be sort of, you know, just automatically happens. It's part of bigger relations in society and bigger processes that come together at that start of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, actually what's very interesting is at the same time, in the early 1800s, there were big advances in how they used water power. I mean, Martin, who's at the back, mentioned it, but there wasn't only water wheels. They're like, okay, we've got water wheels, how do we get water that can be more powerful, on demand when it's not being rained? And a guy called Robert Tom, who invented amazing wet water systems that would go around hills with new reservoirs, with sluice gates that would open and close and power these new mills in very, very advanced ways, and actually made a go of it on the island of Bute in Scotland and made super profits. They had a plan to introduce this to Manchester. Rather than, so this before steam took place, they were going to, the Irwell Valley be powered by the reservoirs they'd make, and the water would flow down and power the factories. It was discussed in the House of Commons. However, it went up against the relations of capitalism, because each individual capitalist is in competition with each other. They were all going to be powered by these same water reservoirs, and some of them were saying, yeah, but we're further down the trail of water. We're at the bottom of the flow. What happens if they use all the water before us? What happens if they get the advantage? They're producing earlier in the day and we're late in the day. And so that idea, it required cooperation to use the water power. It was there, the technology was there to use it, went against the relations of production at that point. And therefore you see why the advantages of using coal versus steam is something that can be individually controlled and much more mobile, able to therefore extract more surplus value from workers, is introduced. And this is the same today. There are technological solutions, well, in renewables, in many other ways, they exist. But they're not used, are they? Because they're up against the big interests that we've talked about. And that's why it's a battle in that way. And nothing is ever automatic in that way. And that's why it brings us really to this question about the miners and workers and things like that. I mean, let's be clear, I'm sure people weren't saying this, but Thatcher was not trying to break the miners because she had environmental concerns. I mean, this is not the case. I mean, she was doing it as a class act. The miners had brought down the Tories in the 1970s. They broke that 1974 government. They brought them down. And so her first thing was, how do I destroy their power? Not at all for the environment. Now, of course, our view was that actually we want to see workers feeling stronger, ordinary people feeling confident in the ways that people have talked about, because actually then on the agenda are other solutions to the problems, other solutions and proposals for running society very differently. And people are right to talk about now, because obviously it's quite a long time on since that dispute, about the climate jobs campaign, because actually there are areas now, like actually the northwest, places like Blackpool, where, you know, there is high unemployment, and the fracking companies come along and they say, well, we can offer jobs, you know, if you join up with us. And this is about saying, actually, there could be jobs in climate, you know, different ones that could be created that would both actually help with the economic crisis and our environment. How do we campaign for that? How do we embed that in? So we are for supporting worker struggles that make our side stronger against those at the top, that have actually, they have an interest, the people at the top, in maintaining fossil fuel use. We don't. We have the power to change it, and those struggles come out in different ways in that way. And these come out in other ways, and I just think, I don't know whether you're saying about other stuff that people want. You see, I think sometimes it's couched in this way, isn't it, that somehow we'll have to have less. But that isn't what we're saying. We're saying that actually, well, partly, no, we haven't talked about it, there is a problem with energy efficiency. Lots of our energy that's generated is completely wasted through transmission, the way it's organised. We can organise it a lot better. And, like I say, the technology exists for us to be able to use it to power the things that we want. But what we're not locked into, what we don't want, is that capitalist growth isn't really about providing for our needs, is it? It's about, when Marx talks about accumulation for accumulation's sake, they're making profits to plough back into production, to make more profits for those people at the top, even if it produces too much of one thing, not enough of another. It's not a rational way of producing. It's a completely irrational way. And we're for saying, actually, we want to meet everyone's needs. Actually, we want to meet more needs than are met today, far more. Many people don't have their needs met, and more. And we could do that on the basis of resources available and how we could use them in an environmental and green way. And I think that is possible. But to finish off, you see, sometimes I'm not surprised that people don't want to think about it. Because it's a massive thing, isn't it? You can feel a bit powerless. Oh my God, you know, these massive companies that have gone through with trillions of dollars, with all their advertising clout and power, how are we going to take them on? And that's why I think sometimes a response can be, oh, it's not really happening, I'll just get on with my life. But the opposite, I'm sure, is true where you are, where people have mobilised, because you're from Scarborough, to stop the fracking that's going to happen there, organise the marches, organise the protests, and that's going to have to continue. And I think we have to be people that show a way forward, that you can do something about it. Actually, like I say, we have to do it on a local level when the frackers come to town, but we are going to have to take it to the government. But we don't just separate it out. We don't just say, well, the environment is here and the rest of the movements are over here. They are part of the same fight, and that's why we raise those environmental concerns very much within all the other movements that we're part of. But we go back to where does power lie? And that's why if we see fossil fuels being locked into capitalism, we see it as a class-driven society. When we talk about workers and that, it's not just about being the most exploited class or anything like that. It's about, it's a source of power, doing all the work, creating all the profits, actually making that system go forward. You have potential power to stop it as well and put on the agenda a different sort of world. And that actually features in every struggle, small and big, people talking about other solutions. And actually our point is, how do we intervene in those points of struggle to put on the agenda the real solutions that can actually save our planet as well?